The Wednesday night Bible study at New Hope Full Gospel Baptist Church smelled like good coffee and old pages. And that combination, the specific warmth of a freshly brewed pot, and the particular mustiness of Bibles that had been carried in purses and backpacks and held in laps through decades of services, was the smell I associated most completely with the life I had built. Not the smell of my classroom, though I loved that too. Not the smell of my apartment on a Sunday morning. This specific combination, in this specific room, on Wednesday evenings, when the Atlanta traffic had finally quieted and the parking lot filled with the faithful who came not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That was the smell of my calling. I had been leading the Wednesday night adult Bible study at New Hope for 6 years. Not as the pastor, Reverend Amos Whitfield, held that authority and exercised it with the steady, unhurried wisdom of a man who had been in the Word long enough to know that wisdom is not the same as urgency, but as the teacher, the one who prepared the curriculum, who chose the texts, who spent 12 to 15 hours every week between Sundays constructing the kind of lesson that gave people something to carry into their Thursday mornings and their Friday afternoons and their Saturday errands, something that changed the texture of ordinary life because the Word had gotten into it. I was good at it. I say that without false modesty, because I have spent enough years in rooms full of people learning things to know the difference between a lesson that lands and a lesson that slides off, and mine landed. People came back. People brought their grown children. People brought their neighbors. The Wednesday night attendance at New Hope had grown from 22 regulars when I started to 63 in the year I'm telling you about. And Reverend Whitfield had said in a board meeting, which he later told me about, not having intended me to know, that the Wednesday night Bible study was the most significant spiritual formation happening inside New Hope's walls. He said that about me, about the work I did. And I held that the way you hold something that confirms what you have been quietly believing about your own calling without letting yourself say it out loud. My name is Claudette Renee Morrison. I am 46 years old. I grew up in New Hope. Third generation, my grandmother Mabel was one of the founding members when the church was established in a living room in southwest Atlanta in 1958. And the framed photograph of those 12 founding members hangs in the church narthex, where I have walked past it thousands of times and touched the frame once on the day I first took over the Bible study, as a private act of consecration between me and the women who built what I was inheriting. I teach English literature at a public high school, the same school I attended, which was not a plan, but a calling that arrived when I returned to Atlanta after graduate school at Howard University and found that the teenagers in my own neighborhood needed exactly what I had been trained to give. I was not married. I had been briefly, in my early 30s, a marriage that lasted 3 years and ended not with drama, but with the quiet dissolution of two people who had chosen each other too quickly, and discovered, with genuine sadness and no particular villain, that they had built something that could not hold the weight of who they were becoming. Deshaun Morrison had been a good man who became a better man after we parted, which I knew because we remained cordial and occasionally encountered each other at community events, and I could see the growth in him the way you can see it in a person when you are not inside the relationship and therefore not the one who needs to manage it. I kept his name because I had published a small volume of Bible study curriculum under it, and because it had become my professional identity, and because at 35 it had seemed like more trouble than it was worth to reclaim Claudette Renee Okafor, which was the name I had been born with and which I kept privately as a kind of interior inheritance even when the public world knew me as Morrison. The Wednesday night study was in the middle of a 14-week series on the book of James when the story I am about to tell you began. We were in week 8, James chapter 3, the tongue as fire, the small thing that sets a great matter ablaze. And I remember thinking, as I prepared that lesson at my kitchen table on the Tuesday evening before, that it was one of the most practically relevant passages in the New Testament, and that I wanted to spend particular time on verse 16. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. I had built the whole lesson around that verse. The specific mechanics of how envy operates in community spaces, how it disguises itself as concern, how it presents as pastoral when it is actually predatory. I did not know that I was preparing a lesson about something that was already happening to me. That is the specific mercy and the specific cruelty of the word. It tells you what you need to know at exactly the right time, and sometimes you don't realize it has already arrived when you think you are still waiting for it. Let me tell you who I was, in the full picture of that season, before I tell you what happened. The Bible study was the center, but it was not the whole. I also sat on the New Hope Ministry Development Committee, which was the body responsible for evaluating and recommending new programs and ministry initiatives to the full church board. I had been on that committee for 4 years, appointed by Reverend Whitfield, and I had used that seat to advocate for a women's theological education track, a community literacy partnership with 3 neighborhood schools, and a grief support ministry that now served not only New Hope members, but families referred from 2 area hospitals. That last one, the grief support ministry, was the one I was most proud of. I had built it from a single Sunday afternoon gathering of 7 women who had all lost someone in the previous year into a structured 12-week program with 2 trained facilitators and a waiting list. I had written the curriculum myself, drawing on my background in literature and my personal theology of lament. The understanding that grief, in the biblical tradition, is not the opposite of faith, but one of its most honest expressions. That curriculum had been requested by 4 other churches in the Atlanta area, and I had shared it freely, without charge, because the thing a gift does when you try to contain it is it stops being a gift. I tell you all of this not to establish my credentials, but to establish what I had to lose. Because this story, like all stories of betrayal, is only as significant as what was at stake. And what was at stake was not just my position or my reputation. It was the work. The specific, built, invested-in work of a woman who had spent 6 years pouring herself into a community and believed, with the full confidence of someone who had been paying attention, that the community was receiving what she poured. The person at the center of what happened was named Brother Gerald Sims. I want to be careful about how I introduce Gerald, because the temptation in telling a story like this one is to introduce the antagonist as a villain from the first mention, to retroactively color every memory of them with what you later learned. I am going to resist that, because Gerald Sims, when I met him 4 years before the story I am telling, was not a villain to me. He was a colleague, a fellow ministry leader, a man I respected. He was 51 years old, a deacon at New Hope for 12 years, a retired accountant who had redirected his professional expertise into the church's financial stewardship ministry. He was organized, articulate, and genuinely knowledgeable about congregational administration. He served on the Ministry Development Committee alongside me, and for the first 2 years of our overlap on that committee, I had found him to be a constructive voice, not always agreeing with my proposals, but engaging with them seriously and on their merits. The shift happened in the 3rd year, and it was subtle enough that I later had difficulty pinpointing exactly when I had first noticed it. The clearest early marker was a committee meeting in January, about 18 months before the events I am moving toward, when I had presented the expanded framework for the Women's Theological Education track, a proposal to move from quarterly seminars to a structured 8-month certificate program with 4 modules and a capstone project. It was a significant expansion. It required budget, it required space, it required a faculty of 3 facilitators, 2 of whom I had already recruited. Gerald's response to the proposal was measured and professional, but there was something underneath it, a slightly increased number of procedural objections, a slightly elevated attention to cost-benefit analysis that had not been as prominent in his responses to other proposals. He asked whether a program of that scope should be overseen by a credentialed administrator rather than run by a ministry volunteer. He asked whether there were benchmarks for evaluating success. He asked whether I had considered the program's potential impact on existing ministry resources. All reasonable questions, all questions I had answers for. And when I provided the answers, he moved on without conceding that the answers were satisfactory. He simply moved on, which meant the concerns had not actually been about the questions. The concerns had been about something else. I noted it. I did not act on the note. I should have acted on the note. The spring semester was the busiest season for my school teaching, and in the second week of March, I came to the Wednesday night study more depleted than I usually allowed myself to arrive. I had been grading a set of junior essays on Zora Neale Hurston that had been both more illuminating and more exhausting than I anticipated. 31 essays on their eyes were watching God, some of them genuinely beautiful, and the process of reading beauty carefully is as tiring as reading mediocrity carelessly. I had prepared my lesson fully. I never came unprepared, that was not who I was, but I was running on the particular fuel of a woman who has given her professional self all day and is now giving her calling self all evening, which is a sustainable practice until the season where it isn't. The study that night was on James chapter 3. The tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. I had built the whole lesson around verse 16. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. I wanted to spend particular time on the specific mechanics of how envy operates in community spaces, how it disguises itself as concern, how it presents as pastoral when it is actually predatory. 61 people were in the room. Gerald Sims was in the third row, which was unusual. He typically sat on the right side near the back, where committee members who might need to leave early often positioned themselves. Tonight he was in the third row, center, which I noted without understanding. The lesson went well. I could feel it going well in the specific way you feel it when the room is receiving. The particular quality of attention that is different from polite listening, the way a room leans slightly forward when the word is landing. I taught for 45 minutes, open for discussion, and the discussion was the kind that continues because people have more to say, rather than because they are being polite about having nothing to say. At the end, after I had closed in prayer and the room was filtering into fellowship mode, coffee being refreshed, small conversations beginning, Gerald Sims came to speak to me. He said, "Sister Claudette, do you have a minute?" I said yes. He said, standing very close and speaking quietly, with the specific undertone of a man presenting something as pastoral concern. "I've been hearing some things from a few members of the congregation that I think you should know about. There's a feeling among some people that the Bible study has become too academic, that it's more like a college lecture than a devotional experience. And some of the women in the theological education track are saying they feel like they're being graded rather than nurtured." I looked at him. I said, "Who specifically is saying this?" He said, "I don't want to put names to it. I'm bringing it to you in the spirit of pastoral concern." I said, "I appreciate that. But if there are specific concerns from specific people, I'd rather address them directly than through intermediary." He said, "I understand. I just thought you should know." And he moved away into the fellowship gathering. I stood with my Bible in my hands, and I felt something that I did not immediately name. It was not quite hurt and not quite anger. It was the specific disorientation of receiving a communication that is framed as concern but functions as something else, a form of information transfer designed to destabilize rather than to help. The criticism was vague enough to be unanswerable and specific enough to be damaging. The refusal to name sources was positioned as protection when it was actually strategic cover. And the phrase, "in the spirit of pastoral concern," had been used in the tone of someone who knows that phrase is a container that can hold almost anything without being challenged. I drove home that evening and I sat in my car in my own parking lot for 15 minutes, and I thought about James chapter 3 verse 16. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. I had prepared a lesson about the exact mechanism that was being used against me before I fully understood it was being used. God tells you what you need to know. Sometimes you have to go back and pick it up after the fact. Lord, I need to be honest with you tonight because I don't know how to be honest with anyone else about this yet. Something was just handed to me in a package labeled concern that I believe was not concern. And the fact that I am immediately suspicious of a colleague's pastoral communication is itself something I need to examine. What if I'm wrong? What if there are real concerns that he simply delivered poorly? What if my response to criticism is the thing that needs adjusting rather than the criticism itself? I am asking you for the discernment to tell the difference between a message that needs to be received and a message that needs to be understood for what it actually is. Because I have been teaching your word long enough to know that the enemy rarely appears as the enemy. He appears as a concerned colleague in the third row on a Wednesday night. I did not wait long. 2 days later, on Friday morning, I called 3 of the women who were currently enrolled in the theological education track. Women I knew well, women I trusted, women who I had specifically asked at multiple points in the program to tell me honestly if something was not working. I called them individually. I asked each of them directly whether they had expressed concerns about the program to Gerald Sims or to anyone else on the ministry committee. All 3 said no. One of them, Sister Patricia Hayes, a woman of 57 who had been at New Hope for 20 years and whose directness I had come to regard as one of the great gifts of our friendship, said, "Claudette, I need to tell you something. Gerald Sims called me 2 weeks ago and asked me if I had concerns about the Bible study. Not the theological education track, the Wednesday night study. He asked me specifically whether I thought it was too academic, whether I thought you were more interested in impressing people than in nurturing them." She paused. I told him I thought the opposite of both of those things. He thanked me and ended the call. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Did he tell you why he was asking?" She said, "He said he was doing an informal survey for the ministry committee." No informal survey of that kind had been requested by or discussed in the ministry committee. I served on that committee. I would have known. He had been constructing a record, not a spontaneous record, a deliberate one, calling members individually, planting the language of concern, testing which descriptions would be repeated back to him as confirmation, building a case document out of cultivated responses. And when the members he approached declined to confirm his narrative, he had brought the narrative to me directly anyway, without attribution, without specifics, without names, because an unattributed concern is more damaging than a named one, because it implies a consensus that cannot be disputed. I called Patricia back, and I asked her one more question. "Has Gerald said anything to you about wanting a different role in the Ministry Development Committee? Something specific to programming or education?" There was a pause. She said, "He mentioned to my husband 3 or 4 months ago that he thought the church needed a director of ministry education, a formal staff position. He said the work was too important to be handled by volunteers." I thanked her. I ended the call. I sat in my classroom during my planning period on a Friday morning, and I thought about James chapter 3. The tongue is a fire, the small thing that sets a great matter ablaze. I thought about the lesson I had been so excited to teach. I thought about preparing, in the specific mercy of the Holy Spirit, a lesson about the exact mechanism that was being used against me before I fully understood it was being used. The Ministry Development Committee met on the second Tuesday of every month. The April meeting was 12 days away. In those 12 days, I did 3 things. First, I documented. I wrote down, dated, and organized everything I knew. Patricia's account of Gerald's call, the timeline of his procedural objections to my proposals, the pattern I had now identified of targeted conversations with specific members designed to solicit negative responses he could attribute to unnamed sources. I wrote it in the precise, organized prose of an English teacher who has been reading and structuring arguments for 21 years. Second, I talked to Reverend Whitfield. Not to file a complaint, not yet, but to give the pastor of my church the information he needed to not be blindsided. Reverend Whitfield was 70 years old and had been in ministry for 40 of those years and was not naive about the mechanics of institutional power and the ways that well-positioned individuals sometimes pursue their ambitions through the erosion of others. He received what I told him with the careful attention of a man who takes both the information and the informant seriously. He did not dismiss Gerald. He did not condemn him. He said, "Claudette, I want you to continue to lead the Wednesday night study with everything you have, and I want you to know that I am watching." Third, I taught. The Wednesday study in the intervening week was James chapter 4, verse 7. "Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you." I taught it with the full understanding of a woman who was living it in real time, and the 63 people in that room felt something in that lesson that several of them mentioned to me afterward. A specific weight, a particular electricity, the sense that the teacher had come to the word that night from inside the experience rather than from above it. Sister Patricia came to me after that study and took my hand and said simply, "I see you." 2 words. The specific gift of being witnessed. The April Ministry Committee meeting began like every other Ministry Committee meeting: prayer, review of minutes, financial report, program updates. There were 7 members present, including Gerald and me, and the item on the agenda that mattered was listed as new business, proposal for Director of Ministry Education position. I had known it was coming because Reverend Whitfield had told me the item had been submitted by Gerald for inclusion on the agenda. The pastor had asked whether I wanted to have the item removed. I said no. I said let it come. Because I had learned from 21 years of teaching that the best response to an argument is not to prevent it from being made, but to be fully prepared when it is made. Gerald presented his proposal for 12 minutes. It was well organized and professionally delivered, as his presentations always were. The position would be a salaried staff role. He proposed a salary range, responsible for overseeing all educational programming at New Hope, including the Bible study, the theological education track, the new members' curriculum, and the youth ministry's academic programming. The role would require a formal application process, a review of qualifications, and appointment by the full church board. He said, in language that had been carefully calibrated, "We have been fortunate to have dedicated volunteers leading our educational ministries, but as the church grows, we need to move toward professional accountability structures that serve our congregation more formally." He did not look at me when he said it. I let him finish. I let the silence sit for 4 seconds after he finished, and then I opened the folder I had brought. I said, "I want to thank Brother Gerald for this proposal, and I want to respond to it directly." I looked around the table. Over the past several months, I have become aware that informal conversations have been conducted with members of this congregation, specifically members of the Women's Theological Education track and the Wednesday night Bible study, in which those members were asked to identify concerns about our educational programming. I want to note for the record that when I followed up directly with those members, none of them reported having expressed the concerns that were subsequently attributed to unnamed sources in this room. I paused. I am not suggesting that the proposal before us is without merit on its face. A Director of Ministry Education may well be a useful position for New Hope as we grow. What I am suggesting is that the process by which this proposal was constructed and the concerns used to support it require examination before the committee acts on it. The room was very still. Reverend Whitfield, who was present as a non-voting pastoral observer, said nothing. He had told me he would say nothing. He had told me that this was my room and my case and my moment to handle, and that he trusted me to handle it. Gerald said, "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Sister Claudette." I said, "I'm suggesting what I said directly, Brother Gerald. The concerns you cited in this proposal, the ones you attribute to unnamed congregation members, I have reason to believe were not organically expressed by those members, but were solicited through targeted conversations designed to produce a specific response. That is a different thing from genuine feedback, and I think the committee deserves to know the difference." He said, "That's a serious accusation." I said, "Yes, it is. I have documentation of what I'm describing, and I'm prepared to share it with the committee and with Reverend Whitfield." The meeting did not resolve that night. It could not. What it did was create a record, a formal, witnessed, documented record, of a concern that had previously existed only in my own knowledge and Patricia's account. The committee voted to table the director position proposal pending a pastoral review of the concerns I had raised. That review was assigned to Reverend Whitfield directly. I walked out of that meeting into the April night air, and I stood in the church parking lot for a long moment. Not triumphant, not relieved. I felt the specific, depleted, necessary feeling of a woman who has done something that needed to be done and knows it cost exactly what it cost. Lord, I did the thing I was afraid to do. I named what was happening in front of people with the authority to act on it. I don't feel victorious. I feel like I just survived something, and I'm not sure what comes next, and the adrenaline has left, and what remains is the specific tiredness of a woman who has been fighting quietly for months and finally said it out loud. I am asking you for two things: the energy to keep going, and the wisdom to know that what I just did was not the end of this, but the beginning of the next part. Show me the next part. I'm ready. Reverend Whitfield conducted his pastoral review over 3 weeks. He spoke individually with Gerald, with me, with Patricia, with 2 other committee members, and with 4 members of the congregation whom Gerald had contacted. The review was thorough and careful, and it produced a written summary that I was given to read. The summary did not condemn Gerald in the language of accusation. It documented a pattern of behavior that had created what the pastor called an environment of manufactured concern rather than authentic accountability. It recommended that Gerald step back from the Ministry Development Committee for a period of 6 months, engage in pastoral counseling with the associate pastor, and that the Director of Ministry Education proposal be considered separately from the circumstances of its introduction, meaning on its merits, in a clean process at a later date. Gerald accepted the pastoral review without public dispute. He did not resign from the church. He stepped back from the committee. He attended the pastoral counseling, which I know because Reverend Whitfield told me so without sharing the content of those sessions. What happened in the interior of Gerald Sims's reckoning with what he had done was not mine to access or manage. I prayed for him with the specific, disciplined prayer of a woman who knows that praying for someone who hurt you is not the same as excusing what they did. It is the releasing of the weight of carrying their accounting on your own back. What I want to tell you now is what the next 18 months built. 3 months after the committee meeting, Reverend Whitfield called me into his office for a conversation that lasted 2 hours and that I want to tell you about in some detail, because it is the kind of conversation that changes the trajectory of a life and deserves more than a summary. He sat across his desk from me and he said, "Claudette, I want to talk to you about the future of this church and your place in it, not as a gesture of compensation for what happened. That would insult you, and I don't intend to insult you. I want to talk about it because I have been watching you lead in this community for 6 years, and what happened with Gerald clarified something for me that I think I had been slow to act on." I said, "What did it clarify?" He said, "That you are operating at a level of institutional responsibility that your current role does not formally recognize, and that the absence of formal recognition creates a kind of vulnerability that was exploited in this situation, and that I am responsible for having allowed that vulnerability to persist." He said that. A 70-year-old pastor who had been in ministry for 40 years said that he was responsible for something he had allowed. I sat with the weight of a man taking accountability in the specific, clean way that institutions rarely manage. He said, "I want to propose a formal role. Not Director of Ministry Education. That was Gerald's framing, and I don't want to give it back to you through his language. What I want to propose is Director of Congregational Life, a position that encompasses educational programming, community ministry, member development, and the church's external partnerships. A salaried position. A position that carries the institutional authority that your work has already been exercising informally." I sat very still. He said, "Before you answer, I want you to know something. I consulted with the board chairwoman about this before this conversation. The board is prepared to approve it. This is not a proposal that requires you to fight for it. It is a recognition that is already decided if you want it." I said, "Reverend Whitfield, can I ask you something directly?" He said, "Please." I said, "Is this because of what happened with Gerald? Because I need it not to be compensation. I need it to be because you believe it is right for the ministry." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "What happened with Gerald accelerated the timeline, but I have believed this was right for the ministry for at least 2 years. I was slow. I am acknowledging that. and I am asking you to accept what is being offered because it is deserved, not because I feel guilty about the delay. I sat in that office for another 40 minutes, asking every question I had about the scope of the role, the budget, the reporting structure, the relationship to the pastoral staff, the board's expectations. I asked all of it because I was not going to walk into the most significant professional and ministerial appointment of my life without knowing exactly what I was walking into. I accepted it. The formal announcement came on the first Sunday in August. Reverend Whitfield made it from the pulpit after the sermon, not as a programmatic update, but as a moment of congregational celebration. He said, "New Hope has a new director of congregational life. Sister Claudette Morrison has served this community for 6 years as our Wednesday night Bible study teacher, as a ministry development committee member, as the founder of our grief support ministry, and as a woman whose love for this congregation has never been in question. She is now serving in an expanded formal capacity, and I want this congregation to receive her and support her and hold her accountable because accountability is what we owe our leaders." The congregation stood, not all at once in the rehearsed way of a church that has been asked to stand, organically, the way a room rises when it means it, starting with the front left section, where the prayer mothers sat, and moving back through the sanctuary until there were 340 people on their feet in New Hope Full Gospel Baptist Church on a Sunday morning in August. I stood at the pulpit and I received it. I did not cry because I had done my crying privately, and my grandmother Mabel had taught me that public moments belong to the community rather than to your own emotion. But I felt something in my chest that I have been trying to find the right word for since, and the closest I have come is this. I felt the specific, earned, irreplaceable feeling of a woman who has been faithful in the work and watched the work become what it was always supposed to be. I said 3 sentences into the microphone. I said, "I am a granddaughter of this church and the granddaughter of a woman who helped build it, and I intend to honor both of those inheritances with everything I have in this new season. I ask for your prayers, your honesty, and your patience, because I am going to make mistakes in this role, and I am going to need you to tell me when I do." I looked out at 340 people, "And I am going to tell you the truth about everything I see." That has always been my commitment in this room, and it is not going to change now that I have a title. The congregation sat back down. The prayer mothers in the front left section were the last to sit. They looked at me the way women look at each other when they recognize something that has traveled a long way to arrive where it needed to be. I want to tell you about the practical architecture of the first year, because this story is not complete without the specific, unglamorous, deeply important work of building an institutional role from the inside. The director of congregational life position came with a salary, not a large one, nothing that would have attracted anyone who was motivated by compensation, but a real salary with a real benefits package that for the first time in my career at New Hope gave me the formal standing of an employee rather than a volunteer. I want to be honest about what that meant practically, because I think the practical dimension is often left out of stories like this one. The salary mattered. Not because I had been struggling financially, I had my teaching income and I managed carefully, but because money is institutional language and being paid for work is a form of acknowledgement that the work is real and valued and expected. The absence of salary for work of this magnitude had been for 6 years a kind of institutional ambiguity that I had accepted without naming. The presence of it now named the work clearly, and that naming mattered. I kept my teaching position. This was a decision I made after significant thought. The church salary, while real, did not replace my teaching income, and more importantly, my classroom was the place where the things I believed about knowledge and community and the lives of young people in my neighborhood were lived out in the most immediate way. I was not willing to leave that. Reverend Whitfield supported the decision. We structured my church role around my school schedule, evenings and weekends for the most part, with 2 afternoons per month covered by personal days for board meetings and major programming events. I reorganized the educational programming into 4 formal tracks: biblical literacy for adults, theological education for women, new members integration, and youth academic ministry. I hired 2 part-time program coordinators, both Black women, both credentialed, both from within the New Hope community, and I established a formal assessment and feedback process for every track, which meant that going forward, no one could claim unnamed concerns without a documented place to put named ones. The structure protected the people leading the programs and the people attending them equally. I expanded the grief support ministry into a full-year cycle rather than a 12-week program, with a maintenance community for graduates, an ongoing monthly gathering for people who had completed the formal program and needed continued connection. The maintenance community became, within 8 months, the fastest-growing ministry at New Hope in terms of new member engagement, because grief is universal and community around grief is rare, and when people find it, they do not leave. I launched a church community partnership with 3 neighborhood organizations, a food pantry, an after-school academic program, and a senior services center, that brought New Hope into formal relationship with institutions that had existed a mile from our parking lot for years without meaningful connection. This was the work I was perhaps most proud of, because it required the church to look at itself not as a destination community that people come to, but as a neighborhood institution that goes out, and that shift in self-understanding was institutional rather than programmatic, and it changed the culture in ways that individual programs could not. Sister Patricia Hayes became my informal advisor and my most consistent accountability partner. She had the specific gift of telling me when something I was doing well was making me complacent, and the specific courage to say it to my face rather than around it. I valued that beyond what I could articulate to her, though I tried. Gerald Sims returned to active membership at New Hope after his 6-month pastoral process. He did not return to the Ministry Development Committee. He remained in the congregation's life, attending services, participating in the facilities ministry, present at church events. I encountered him regularly. I want to tell you about those encounters honestly, because the story is not complete without them. The first significant encounter was about 10 months after the committee meeting at the church's fall festival. We were in the same section of the fellowship hall, and the natural movement of the event brought us within conversation distance. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has done the work of reckoning and is not sure how the person in front of him has filed the outcome. He said, "Sister Claudette." I said, "Brother Gerald." He said, "I owe you an apology, a direct one, not through Pastor Whitfield, not through the committee process. I was wrong in what I did. I was motivated by something I'm not proud of, and I acted on it in a way that was harmful and dishonest. I'm sorry." I looked at him. A man in his 50s who had spent 6 months doing the work of seeing himself clearly, standing in a fellowship hall at a fall festival, saying a direct and undecorated sorry. No additional justification, no explanation of circumstances, just the apology and the willingness to receive whatever came back. I said, "Gerald, I receive that. And I want to tell you something true. What you did accelerated something that I believe was already coming. The harm was real, and I'm not minimizing it. But the outcome, where I am now, what I'm building, I would not have gotten here this directly without the pressure that came from what you did. That is not a thank you. The harm was still harm. But I am not in the position of someone who lost because of what you did. I am in the position of someone who found, partly because of it." He nodded. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at me. He said, "You're a better person than I would have been in your position." I said, "I don't know that. I know what I chose. That's different." We went back to our respective conversations. It was not warm, it was not friendship, but it was real, and real is the better foundation. 14 months into the Director of Congregational Life role, Reverend Whitfield announced that he would be stepping back from the senior pastorate at the end of the following year, at age 71, to transition into a pastor emeritus role. He had been in active senior leadership for 31 years. The announcement was made to the board first and then to the congregation, and it was received with the specific combination of grief and gratitude that a long-serving, beloved pastor's announcement of transition always generates. The board formed a pastoral search committee. I was appointed to chair it. Not because I was a candidate. I was not, and had no intention of being. But because the institutional architecture of a congregation's most significant transition required someone with the organizational capacity, the theological grounding, the relational trust of the congregation, and the institutional memory of the ministry's current state to hold the process together without capturing it. Reverend Whitfield nominated me himself. The board approved unanimously. I chaired the pastoral search process for 11 months. It was the most demanding institutional work I have ever done, not more spiritually demanding than the grief ministry or more intellectually demanding than the Bible study curriculum. Differently demanding in the specific way of work that requires you to hold the preferences of 340 people with the discernment of someone who knows that what people say they want and what they actually need are not always the same thing, and that the person who does this work well is the person who can hear both and work toward the latter without dismissing the former. We called Reverend Camille Thorne, a 44-year-old black woman pastor from Birmingham, a graduate of Emory's Candler School of Theology, with 11 years of congregational leadership experience and a theology of community formation that aligned with the direction New Hope had been building. The vote was 297 in favor, 11 abstaining, 0 opposed. Reverend Thorne arrived the following September. At Reverend Thorne's installation service, a Sunday afternoon ceremony with 700 people in attendance, pastors from 11 partner churches, and a choir of 60 voices doing what choirs do when they have been given a worthy occasion. She said in her installation remarks, "New Hope is a church that has been preparing for this next season for years. I can see the preparation in the structure of its ministries and the cohesion of its programming and the spirit of its people. I did not come here to build from nothing. I came here to take the baton from hands that have been running a long time and are ready to pass it." She looked at me when she said it. I was sitting in the front row. Grandma Mabel's founding photograph was on the wall of the narthex outside this sanctuary, and I had touched the frame on the day I took over the Bible study, and I would touch it again on the way out today, because some acts of consecration bear repeating at significant intervals. I held my grandmother's memory in my chest, and I said, "Thank you to God for the full, specific, cost-bearing journey from a Wednesday night study room to this installation service, the betrayal and the documentation and the committee meeting and the pastoral review and the directorship and the grief ministry expansion and the pastoral search and everything in between. All of it, every piece of it load-bearing. Today, I am 48 years old, and I am the Director of Congregational Life at New Hope Full Gospel Baptist Church, and I am a granddaughter of this church, and I am in my 23rd year of teaching English literature to teenagers in Southwest Atlanta, and I am the person who leads the Wednesday night Bible study, which has grown to 81 regular attendees, and which I will lead until God tells me clearly that it is time to hand it to someone who is being prepared for it the way I was, once prepared for it. I am teaching James again this fall, starting over from chapter 1, which is the right chapter to start from because James chapter 1 is where the whole epistle begins. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. I have taught those verses many times. I have believed them at varying depths depending on what season I was in. This fall, teaching them for the first time as a woman who has been to the bottom of the testing and watched the perseverance produce exactly what the text promised, complete, not lacking anything, I will teach them from the deepest place I have ever occupied. And the 60, 70, 80 people in that room will feel it. Not because I am performing depth, because I am standing in it. My grandmother Mabel would recognize the woman I have become, not because I have become anything she could not have predicted, but because she spent a lifetime believing that the women of this church, the women who carried the faith forward through the work of their hands and the faithfulness of their presence, were capable of exactly this, of taking betrayal and making it productive, of taking exclusion and making it the doorway to a room larger than the one they were kept from. She built this church in a living room in 1958. I am building it forward. That is the calling. That is the inheritance. That is what it means to be wounded in the Bible and come out the other side knowing the word more completely than you did before the wound, because the wound took you deeper into it than comfort ever could. A reflection. For the woman who was underestimated in the house of God. Someone looked at what you built and saw not a gift to be honored, but a threat to be managed. Someone used the language of the church, concern, accountability, pastoral care, to dress up something that was none of those things. And for a season, you may have wondered whether the problem was you, whether you were too much, too academic, too ambitious, too invested in your own vision to see the community's real needs. I want you to hear this. The testing of your gifts in the house of God is not evidence that your gifts are wrong. It is evidence that they are real enough to be worth opposing. Mediocrity does not attract the kind of opposition you have encountered. Excellence does. Calling does. The anointing that is building something significant draws a specific kind of resistance. And James chapter 1 tells you what to do with it. Consider it joy. Not because the harm is not real. It is. But because the perseverance it produces is producing something in you that the comfort of unopposed work could never have built. You were not betrayed because you were weak. You were targeted because you were strong, and the targeting has made you stronger than the targeting intended. That is the specific justice of a God who takes what was meant for your harm and turns it into the exact material of your promotion. The room they tried to keep you out of? You are about to be appointed to lead it, not in spite of what happened, because of what you became in the middle of it. Stay faithful. Stay documented. Stay in the Word, and stay in the room. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever been faithful in a ministry and watched someone try to use your faithfulness against you, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me what you did next. Tell me what God built from the opposition. This community is for women who did not give up when the church itself became the source of the wound, and who came out the other side still believing and still building. Like this video if it gave you something to hold. Share it with the woman in your circle who is in the middle of her opposition right now and needs to know what is waiting on the other side. Subscribe to Sister Circle Stories, because every week we come to this table and we tell the truth about faith and betrayal and resilience and what it looks like to be a Black woman called to the house of God and refused by its gatekeepers and appointed by its Lord. We are here, every week, and we are not going anywhere.